Let's talk about something that makes modern people deeply uncomfortable, but was absolutely key to understanding ancient Rome: the price of human beings. Not in some abstract sense, but actual numbers. Cold, hard currency, changing hands in exchange for a person's entire existence. Because in ancient Rome, slaves weren't just part of the economy, they were the economy. And like any product, they had a price tag. Before we dive into the numbers, we need to understand just how massive slavery was in Rome. We're not talking about a handful of servants in wealthy households. We're talking about an empire built on the backs of enslaved people. At the height of Roman power, particularly during the time of Emperor Augustus in Italy, estimates suggest that as many as 30% of the population were slaves. Across the broader empire, the figure was lower, around 10 to 20% depending on the region, but we're still talking about millions of human beings in chains. Scholars estimate that in the first century, between 5 and 10 million people across the entire Roman Empire were enslaved. The Roman economy ran on human labor that could be bought, sold, and traded like cattle. Agriculture, mining, construction, manufacturing, domestic service, entertainment, education, even government work depended heavily on enslaved workers. The wealthy owned hundreds or thousands of slaves. The middle class owned several. Even some of the urban poor managed to own at least one. This wasn't something on the edges of society. It was woven into every single aspect of Roman life. So what did these human beings cost? The answer is complicated and often disturbing. The price of a slave in ancient Rome varied wildly depending on dozens of factors, and the range stretched from dirt cheap to eye-wateringly expensive. Let's start at the bottom of the market. After a successful military campaign, when Roman legions returned home with thousands of captives in chains, prices dropped. Simple supply and demand. When you've got massive amounts of a product flooding the market all at once, prices crash. During Julius Caesar's brutal conquest of Gaul from 58 to 51 before the Common Era, 58 to 51 BCE ancient sources claim staggering numbers. Plutarch, writing about Caesar's campaigns, states that 1 million Gauls died and another million were enslaved. Now, these figures come from ancient historians who had their own agendas and often pumped up numbers for dramatic effect. Modern scholars are skeptical of these exact numbers, noting that Caesar's own writings were propaganda designed to make him look good. Still, even if the real numbers were lower, the scale of enslavement during these wars was clearly massive. When thousands of captives flooded the markets, buyers could be picky and prices dropped. For the most basic, unskilled laborer fresh from the battlefield, prices could be remarkably low. We're talking about war captives with no particular skills, no education, no special qualities, just strong backs and the ability to work until they dropped. During periods of lots of slaves for sale, the cheapest ones might sell for a few hundred denarii. To put that in perspective, a Roman soldier under Julius Caesar earned about 225 denarii per year, so even a cheap slave might cost roughly what a soldier earned in a year, maybe a bit more. But that was the flaw. Most slaves cost more. For a general-purpose slave with no special skills, the ancient playwright Plautus mentions prices around 500 denarii for a male female slave could go for higher prices, sometimes reaching 6,000 denarii, though this varied enormously based on age, looks, and other factors. We have actual receipts from Pompeii that survived the volcanic eruption in 79. One shows a slave selling for 2,500 sestertii, which equals 625 denarii. Since 4 sestertii made 1 denarius, from Roman Britain, we have records of a slave girl named Fortunata who was sold for 600 denarii. Interestingly, the buyer was himself a slave, showing how some enslaved people with access to money they were allowed to keep could even purchase other slaves. Discoveries from the gold mining regions of what's now Romania revealed ancient tablets recording slave sales from the 2nd century. One contract from the year 135 shows a slave girl sold for 205 denarii. Another from 142 records a slave boy purchased for 600 denarii. But these were all relatively ordinary slaves. The real money came when you moved up the quality ladder. Skilled slaves commanded serious prices. We're talking about craftsmen, artisans, workers with knowledge that took years to develop. During Augustus's time, a trained vineyard worker could cost around 2,000 denarii. That's 4 times the price of a basic laborer. These were investments. A skilled slave could generate solid income for their owner, so paying more up front made sense. Then you get into the truly expensive category, highly educated slaves. The Romans, despite conquering Greece militarily, were absolutely conquered culturally by Greek civilization. They loved Greek philosophy, literature, mathematics, medicine, all of it. And Greek slaves who came from educated backgrounds were incredibly valuable teachers, tutors, accountants, doctors, secretaries, librarians, even business managers. These weren't just bodies to do work. These were people with skills that wealthy Romans desperately wanted. According to Plautus, Cato the Elder was willing to pay between 500 and 1,500 denarii for a slave. But he also complained about wealthy Romans who would pay up to 2,500 denarii for a beautiful young person. And that was just the beginning. For a slave trained in music, the price could reach 4,000 denarii. That's roughly 18 years of a soldier's salary for one person who could play an instrument and sing at dinner parties. The truly wild prices came at the top end of the market. We have records of individual slaves selling for staggering sums. One documented case mentions a slave who cost 100,000 sestertii, or 25,000 denarii. That's more than 100 years of a soldier's pay for one person. The historian Suetonius records that a Roman named Quintus Catullus purchased a language teacher named Daphnis for 700,000 sestertii, which works out to 175,000 denarii. To put that in context, the great speaker Cicero spent 875,000 denarii to purchase his huge villa on the Palatine Hill in Rome, right in the heart of the most expensive real estate in the ancient world. This single educated slave cost a fifth of what a luxury mansion in downtown Rome would run you. So what made a slave cost 200 denarii versus 200,000? Several factors came into play. Age mattered enormously. Slaves in their teens and 20s cost the most because they had the most working years ahead of them. Children were cheaper unless they showed exceptional promise. Older slaves, unless they had rare knowledge or abilities, sold for less because they had fewer years left. Physical condition was crucial. Slaves stood naked on auction blocks so buyers could inspect them thoroughly. Any visible scars, signs of disease, physical problems, or weakness drove prices down. Buyers wanted healthy people who could work hard for years. Roman law actually required sellers to reveal known health problems, any history of running away, suicide attempts, even mental issues. This was unusual because for most goods, the rule was buyer beware. But for slaves and cattle, sellers had to be honest by law. Skills and education were perhaps the biggest price makers. An unskilled laborer heading to the fields or mines was one thing. A trained craftsman was another. But a slave who could read, write, calculate, teach, heal, manage accounts was worth exponentially more. Looks played a disturbing but real role. Beautiful slaves, both male and female, commanded top prices. The Romans had particular beauty standards, and slaves who fit them got higher bids. Young, attractive slaves might be purchased for domestic service in wealthy households, where they'd be seen by guests. Some were bought specifically for sexual exploitation, a reality we can't ignore when discussing Roman slavery. Honestly, origin and ethnicity influenced prices too. Greek slaves were generally more expensive because of their perceived sophistication and education. Slaves from what Romans considered civilized regions, Egypt, Syria, other parts of the Greek-speaking world, typically cost more than those from areas Romans viewed as barbaric, like Gaul or Germania. Roman buyers had preferences based on stereotypes, and those preferences drove prices up or down. Gender created interesting price patterns. Basic female slaves sometimes sold for less than males because they were seen as less capable of heavy physical labor. But attractive young women could command crazy prices, far exceeding what male slaves typically sold for. Supply and demand at any given moment dramatically affected prices. After a major military victory, when thousands of captives flooded the markets, prices dropped. One stark example comes from after the Bar Kokhba revolt was crushed in 135. This was the third and final major Jewish rebellion against Roman rule. The historian Cassius Dio claims 580,000 Jews died in the fighting. Like many ancient casualty figures, this number is probably inflated, but what's clear is that the devastation was huge. Based on scholarly estimates, more than 100,000 Jewish captives were enslaved and sold throughout the empire. Multiple sources say the slave markets at Hebron and Gaza were so flooded with captives that prices crashed dramatically. Some sources claim Jewish slaves temporarily sold for the same price as a horse, though this might be more dramatic language than actual economic data. What we can say for sure is that massive numbers of slaves following military campaigns caused big price drops. So what did these prices actually mean? How do we understand these ancient numbers? Let's look at comparisons. A Roman soldier in the 1st century earned about 225 denarii per year initially. This wage increased over time as emperors competed for military loyalty. Under Emperor Domitian, soldier pay jumped to 300 denarii annually. Under Septimius Severus, it increased to 600 denarii per year. A centurion made significantly more. Under Domitian, centurions earned 1,500 denarii per year. For ordinary expenses, let's look at what things cost in Pompeii before the eruption. An amphora of cheap wine, that's about 7 gallons, cost around 19 denarii. A loaf of bread cost a few small coins. A basic tunic cost around 4 denarii. Graffiti preserved on a Pompeii wall mentions that maintaining an average household of about 3 people plus a slave cost around 2 denarii per day, or about 730 denarii per year. When you consider that a basic slave cost 500 denarii, that's more than twice a soldier's annual salary. A skilled slave at 2,000 denarii represented nearly 9 years of a soldier's pay. And those elite educated slaves selling for tens or hundreds of thousands of denarii, those were investments only the truly wealthy could afford. Where did all these sales happen? Slave markets existed throughout the Roman Empire. In Rome itself, we know of major slave trading areas next to the Temple of Castor at the Forum and near the Campus Martius. These markets had special holding areas for slaves waiting to be sold. The city of Puteoli, modern Pozzuoli near Naples, was likely the second busiest slave market in Italy, but the most infamous slave market in the ancient world was on the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea. In 166 before the Common Era, Rome declared Delos a free port, meaning merchants there didn't have to pay taxes that Rhodes charged. This was actually a political move to hurt Rhodes, Rome's rival. The result was that Delos exploded into the Mediterranean's primary hub for slave trading. The ancient writer Strabo claimed the market on Delos could handle the sale of 10,000 slaves in a single day. Modern scholars think this number is probably exaggerated, more dramatic language than accurate reporting. Even if the real number was a fraction of that claim, we're still talking about a massive operation for trafficking human beings. Pirates supplied much of Delos's inventory. With Rome's approval and a tax-free port that asked no questions, pirate ships raided villages across the eastern Mediterranean, then sailed to Delos to auction their human cargo. Slave markets operated in most large cities. Slaves were paraded with signs around their necks advertising their qualities and problems. As mentioned, Roman law required sellers to reveal certain information: any tendency to run away, previous suicide attempts, known health problems, and where the slave came from. If a dealer couldn't guarantee a slave's quality, that slave had to wear a special cap to warn buyers they were purchasing at their own risk. The buying process was deliberately dehumanizing. Slaves were displayed naked so buyers could conduct thorough inspections. Buyers would check teeth, muscles, skin. Looking for any problems, slaves were treated as livestock, poked and prodded, and evaluated purely as products. How did things change over Rome's long history? During the Republic, especially during the massive conquests of the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, huge numbers of slaves flooded into Italy. The wars against Carthage, Macedonia, and Greece brought hundreds of thousands of captives to Roman slave markets. This changed Roman society fundamentally. Small family farms couldn't compete with massive estates worked by slave gangs. Free Roman farmers were pushed out, many flooding into Rome itself. This disruption contributed to the political instability that eventually led to the Republic's collapse. Behind every one of these price tags was a human being, someone with dreams, fears, families, identities. The market's cold efficiency in assigning money values to human lives shows something deeply disturbing about Roman civilization. Yes, Rome gave us incredible architecture, literature, law, engineering, and philosophy. But it built all of that on a foundation of human trafficking and exploitation on a scale that's hard to fully grasp. The slaves working in the mines, condemned to dig in darkness until they died, represented the absolute bottom of Roman society. Sources describe them chained together, working under brutal bosses, dying in large numbers from exhaustion, injury, and disease. Life in the mines was measured in months or a few years at most. Agricultural slaves lived in barrack-like structures, often kept in chains. Even household slaves, who might have enjoyed better food and shelter, still lived without freedom, unable to own property, form legal marriages, or control their own lives. Some slaves could hope for freedom granted by their owners. This was more common in Rome than in many other slave societies. Slaves could sometimes purchase their own freedom if allowed to save money, but this possibility was available to only a minority. Most slaves lived and died in bondage, and the system perpetuated itself through the brutal fact that children born to enslaved mothers were automatically slaves themselves. Understanding how much Roman slaves cost isn't just historical trivia. It's a window into the foundations of one of history's most important civilizations. Every amphitheater, aqueduct, road, and villa we admire from ancient Rome was built at least partly through slave labor. Those numbers, from 200 denarii to 200,000, represent more than economic data. They represent lives stolen, families torn apart, and human dignity reduced to market value. The grandeur of Rome came at a terrible price, paid by millions who had no choice. If this deep dive opened your eyes to the uncomfortable truths behind ancient Rome, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that doesn't shy away from the hard questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.